All right, welcome everybody. We do have a quorum. It is 1:30 p.m. on Tuesday, June 7th, 2022, and you're at a Wausau Waterworks Commission meeting. Thanks for joining us. We do have Commissioners Robinson and Force along with me here, so we'll be doing the heavy lifting. So our first item on our agenda is item number 1, to approve the minutes of the May 3rd, 2022 meeting. I would entertain a motion. I have a motion by Robinson to accept the minutes and a second by Force. Any discussion? Otherwise, all of those in favor of approving the minutes can signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? That carries unanimously. Thank you. All right. We are now into item number 2, Director's Report on Utility Operations. I know that Director Lindman is with us remotely, and we also have Scott and Ben here, so I don't know who wants to kick us off, but feel free.
Yeah, I guess if any of the commissioners have any questions on for update for them.
Yes, Commissioner Robinson. Nope. Oh, your mic isn't on. I don't know. Probably because of me, actually.
Does it work now?
Yep, we're good.
All right.
I had it turned off, sorry.
All right, on the update on the lead service line replacement plan, there was a map that was put in there relative to the priorities. Did we factor in the age? Is our plan going to look at the age of the infrastructure? Because I didn't see that as one of the criteria in the narrative, Scott. So are we looking, I would assume that our older pipes in some of the newer developments don't have lead, which is why they were the lighter colors.
Yeah, the map focuses right along the river corridor on both sides. That's generally the oldest part of the town. That's where most of our lead resides. So there wasn't any differentiation given between 1902 lead pipe and 1950 lead pipe. It was mostly given on the criteria that were listed.
But as we go forward, will we be developing a GIS database as the best of our ability of where we have lead in the ground specific to a given corridor or street?
We are. We're compiling that right now, and I believe the note had mentioned that we were going to have a meeting with our consultant this week, just specifically for lead. We've identified some gaps that we're going to need to fill with that program, and to actually make a useful map or lay out a useful program, we're going to have more inventory laid out for us, or at least fill those gaps in so we have more information to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Scott, I had a question. This map, which I appreciate, although it doesn't show all the detail I'd like, this is the map based on the survey?
That's the initial map, Jim. That was basically an overlay. What they did is took the city GIS information and then overlaid I apologize, I was out yesterday. The information.
It would be helpful
overlaid.
to have major streets marked on this map
Yeah.
so we could. And then the other question I have is critical sites. How are those determined? What makes a critical site?
It's going to be homes with children under 5,
Okay, you've got that
high
little-
lead. So if we end up with high lead homes that we test, those would be addressed on an individual basis. So we would replace those outside of the regular program.
Okay, so you identify a high lead,
Mr. Force, they're asking you to put your mic a little closer to your mouth.
a high lead location. How is that determined? Is that a test that you do?
It is. It's our compliance sampling.
Okay.
So where, on those critical sites, do we know if those are system-related or internal to the structure? Because you can get lead out of, your faucets and others. So where are we, what's our sampling point?
We don't know that yet. We're not to that point. These critical spots are off of our historical data on our lead sampling that dates back to the 90s. So these are the high spots that were sampled from then on. They were just overlaid onto the map to help develop a plan.
One would suspect that some of the newer developments or newer housing might be more internal or not. Is that a fair assumption? When did we stop using lead pipes in our distribution system?
1965 in the fall is what traditionally has been, I would say, institutional knowledge here. We're finding some up into the 70s.
And Scott, one more question. These critical sites, is that an individual property or is that like a neighborhood?
That'll be an individual property.
Okay.
All right. Any other points you'd like to pull out and discuss or ask questions about in the director's report or anything you want to highlight?
Am I, as a commissioner, am I satisfied that our lead service line replacement program has targeted and satisfied the requirements for schools and child care centers, daycare centers? That was discussed a long time
Yeah,
ago.
none of the schools in the Wausau School District have lead service lines.
Okay.
And daycares, we did initially in 2017 when the first round of lead service line
Right.
funding for 100% to all the daycares.
Okay.
We went through on all the registered daycares and replaced those that allowed us to.
Okay. Meaning the property owner was okay with you doing that?
Correct.
Okay.
There was a few, I believe, back at that point that didn't for some reason take that. take
Okay,
the funding.
right, yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Or do you feel good about moving on? All right. I'm seeing that we're good to move on to item number 3. This is our presentation, discussion, and update on the pilot study results from Donahue. So whoever would like to present, we are ready for you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yep.
Susan Wojtkiewicz with Donahue and Associates. We also have Andrew Dow remotely joining us. And we're here to present both an update on the pilot study and then a discussion of an evaluation of both interim and long-term strategies for PFAS, the PFAS response. Basically, we've looked at numerous alternatives and been winnowing and screening them down for a couple of options here. We're not necessarily looking for you to make a decision today on these options, but we wanted to show you what the possible options look like and what a path forward could be from this point. So with that, I will let Andrew take over.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Can everyone hear me today?
Yes, thank you.
Great, good afternoon. So yeah, we'd like to start the briefing today with an update on what we've observed from the pilot study so far and how that informs the evaluation of alternatives for PFAS treatment strategies. If you can advance to the next slide, please. I'll speak to some of the data that we've compiled. So this graph here is a summary of pilot study results for what we're calling focus compounds. In this case, we're focusing on PFOA, PFOS, and the 4 precursor compounds that are combined in the DHS recommendation of 20 parts per trillion that was included in the Cycle 11 rulemaking correspondence. If you recall, our pilot study, the influent water from that is water that's treated at the existing water plant. And the combined concentration of those 6 compounds is shown in the blue data points in the graph there. And then our pilot study includes a column containing the regenerable ion exchange resin that was designed to be used at the new water plant for organics removal objectives. And the data or the concentrations of those compounds coming out of that ion exchange process are shown in the orange data points in the graph. What we've seen so far is that the data shown here basically represents 4 months of a little over 4 months of simulated full-scale operation. So over that time, in the samples collected, the concentration of those compounds has remained below 20 parts per trillion. We have noted some variability in those concentrations, and in particular, we've noticed a cyclical pattern whenever there's a regeneration event where the resin is regenerated to restore its TOC removal capacity, we actually are seeing a temporary drop in PFAS concentrations, and then seeing that increase over the course of that operating cycle. When we look at the full-scale operation, there would be multiple vessels that are operated in parallel at different stages of their operating cycle. So the actual blended concentration from the full-scale system would be somewhere in the middle of these data points. So effectively, we would expect it to be in the range of, say, 10 to 15 parts per trillion. So it's clear that there is a benefit that's being provided with this resin. We can only speak to the duration of that benefit with respect to the full-scale time simulated so far. To make any sort of conclusions beyond that, we need to continue operating the pilot to increase that full-scale time that's simulated. Our hypothesis is that this benefit will diminish over time, which is why this isn't considered or recommended as a standalone permanent or long-term solution. And the pilot study also includes supplemental PFAS treatment in the form of granular activated carbon and PFAS selective single-use ion exchange resin downstream of this regenerable ion exchange process. And the concentrations of these 6 compounds coming out of those pilot columns of the supplemental treatment have been below the detection limits for those compounds over this time in the data that we've collected so far. You can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So the regenerable ion exchange resin is providing a number of treatment benefits that this pilot study has also been an opportunity to confirm and study further. First of all, it is providing complete removal of visible color from the water. I don't know how well this appears on your screen, but in the photograph pictured here, there's a sample of the pilot influent, the water from the existing plant on the far left, and then the water produced from the regenerable ion exchange resin next to that. We can see that the single-use ion exchange resin that's used parallel without using this regenerable ion exchange process as pretreatment had the green color present still in the water within just a couple weeks of pilot operation. So that resin is not effective in removing color. And furthermore, when we look at TOC reduction, we see the same for that as well. So in the bar graph here, the blue bars represent the existing plant water. The orange bars represent the TOC levels produced from the regenerable ion exchange resin, and then the green bars, which increase over time, are the TOC in the single-use ion exchange resin. So that single-use resin at this point is no longer providing any TOC reduction, which were water quality goals for the new plant. Furthermore, this regenerable resin is providing effective pretreatment for GAC and single-use ion exchange as polishing technologies or supplemental PFAS treatment technologies. In particular, this ability to maintain the TOC concentration below 2 milligrams per liter with the regenerable resin has really significant benefits for operation of GAC or the single-use ion exchange downstream, and is consistent with ion exchange resin manufacturer recommendations for this application. And then lastly, it is also providing some PFAS removal as well. Again, expected to be a temporary benefit, but something that can be of value in the short term at least. Next slide, please. So the illustrations here represent the 3 options that the pilot study was designed to simulate. The first 2 options reflect this combined treatment of pretreatment with the regenerable ion exchange resin to remove TOC, followed by PFAS selective polishing with GAC or single-use ion exchange. And then the third option was just use of single-use ion exchange by itself in place of the regenerable resin, which does not meet all the treatment objectives and also is showing evidence of significant organic fouling of that resin in the pilot, with differential pressures about 3 or 4 times we're seeing with the pre-treated resin in option 2. Next slide, please. So before we talk in a little more detail about the short list of alternatives that we've evaluated in more detail, we thought it would be helpful to just briefly zoom out and provide a recap of the various alternatives or options that have been discussed and considered at one point in time as potential responses to PFAS in this water system. And so some of them include consideration of potential source water-based strategies, several treatment strategies with established technologies, and then consideration of any emerging technologies that might be applicable. And a number of those options or possibilities were sort of screened out for various reasons, including feasibility, costs, or other practicality implications, including schedule implications, if nothing else, in the case of some of the emerging technologies that maybe aren't ready for more immediate or rapid implementation. So the 2 established treatment technologies that were most applicable for Wausau's needs were determined to be GAC and ion exchange. We did identify and evaluate capital costs and life cycle costs for more than 12 different sizes and configurations of these technologies. And then we've curated that list down to a short list of 4 alternatives that we'll be briefing the Commission on today and discussing the refined capital and operating costs for those to provide some perspective on cost and impacts to ratepayers for those options and their benefits. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes that short list of 4 treatment alternatives that we would like to brief the Commission on today. The first alternative is basically the most expensive alternative, but it's what we would consider the no compromises option, or the most conservative, so to speak, option. The other alternatives represent different angles or attempts to achieve potential cost savings or value engineering that have different compromises in one form or another inherent in them, but that would still be viable strategies for meeting treatment objectives for PFAS removal. And so, for example, alternative 2 reduces the cost and footprint of the system by reducing the number of vessels required, but requires operation of those vessels in a different configuration that I'll talk more about in a moment, parallel operation versus conventional lead lag. Alternative 3 saves capital costs by going to shorter vessels, smaller vessels, but that also requires parallel operation to achieve the same throughput or capacity. And then alternative 4 is using ion exchange, which does allow for lead lag operation in a smaller footprint because of the higher loading rates that ion exchange can be operated at. And the last point to make about particularly alternative 3 and 4 is that those were also considered in the context of potential rapidly available equipment. So in other words, there is one or more supplier that has what we would call off-the-shelf vessels available for more rapid procurement, whereas the taller vessels would need to be custom fabricated to order. A quick note about what we're referring to when we talk about lead lag versus parallel operation. So in conventional lead lag operation, the media changeout is triggered by breakthrough for the first bed. So the water being treated flows through the lead bed, and then all of that water flows through a second bed in series. The entire bed depth of that lead bed is used because even when you have breakthrough from that lead bed, it's essentially caught in the lag bed. So there's higher capital costs because a greater footprint is required for a given throughput, but the operating cost is lower because you make more efficient use of the media. And the other key difference is that it does provide more security, so to speak, against partial breakthrough or leakage of PFAS into the entry point water that goes to customers, because you essentially have a belt and suspenders approach where the lag vessel is always that backstop for PFAS treatment. In parallel operation, you're reducing your footprint by essentially doubling your hydraulic capacity by sending water through the beds in parallel. In this case, your media changeout is triggered by sampling within the bed, and it requires proactive replacement of the media, ideally before the entire bed is exhausted. This results in lower capital costs, but understandably results in an operating cost premium because the media usage is not as efficient, and you don't have that backup of treatment in essentially a redundant bed behind the bed that may be breaking through. You're relying on proactive changeout and then blending of water quality from beds that are at different stages of breakthrough. Next slide, please. To provide some perspective on the location and footprint of the treatment systems with respect to any of these alternatives, the most cost-effective location that we've identified at this time is just to the north of the existing process building, as pictured there. That would allow efficient tie-in to existing process piping with minimal additional piping cost. The footprint there is the approximate footprint for the largest 12-vessel alternatives. It would shrink somewhat, of course, for alternatives 2 and 4 that only have 8 vessels. Next slide, please. This graph is a summary of the capital cost or opinions of probable capital cost, including engineering, that we've estimated at this time. You can see that the cost differential between the most expensive alternative and the least expensive alternative from a capital cost standpoint is about $4.5 million. Next slide, please. This graph is a summary of the annual operating costs estimated for these alternatives. That operating cost is comprised of 2 bins, as it's shown here in this graph, where we have the blue bar or portion representing the pumping energy cost, which is highest for the ion exchange alternative, and then the media replacement and disposal cost, which comprises the majority of the annual operating cost for all 4 of these alternatives. We're also showing a range represented by the error bars for each of these alternatives, and that range represents a potential range or most probable range of bed life that we might see for the different media being considered, either GAC or ion exchange. And in the case of GAC, also reflects the range for some potential variation in the costs of change out and disposal of the GAC. And then the other point just to make here is that we are showing a slight operating cost premium for alternative 2 and 3 relative to alternative 1 because of the less efficient use of the media with the parallel operation for the sake of the potential capital cost savings. Next slide, please. Here we've combined those capital costs and then the 20-year present value of those annual operating costs into a 20-year life cycle cost. And that the total life cycle cost is represented here with the 2 contributions of those components, the CapEx contribution and the OpEx contribution, with the range shown as well. And those are all based on a discount rate that's currently set by DNR for use in planning studies of 2.875% for the future value of money. And one thing to note here is that because of the probable range of bed life for ion exchange being somewhat smaller than the potential range for GAC, you do see that the worst case that we're showing for ion exchange is lower than the worst case for GAC. But then on average, when you look at the orange bar, the operating costs for these 4 alternatives are relatively similar in a 20-year present value standpoint. Next slide, please. We also thought it would be helpful perspective to translate these capital and operating costs into an estimated residential rate impact that would be based on the debt service associated with the capital cost to construct the project, and then the operating cost component as well. One thing to note about this is that the CapEx or debt service component does go away after a certain period of time. And furthermore, these costs are not assuming that there's any capital subsidy in the form of grant money obtained or principal forgiveness on a loan. So any subsidies in those forms would decrease that debt service component of the cost and the impact to ratepayers. So that's something to keep in mind when looking at this. And then just to clarify, you'll notice that the left-hand y-axis is the monthly rate increase, and then the right-hand y-axis is translating that to the quarterly rate increase that would appear on a quarterly bill. Keeping in mind that the actual, monthly rate is going to depend on a number of factors, including, water usage and the number of customers at a given time. But this is to provide some reasonable perspective on what those impacts could be. Next slide, please. We also thought it would be helpful to put this in the context of other current rate structures for other communities throughout the state. Right in the middle of this graph or this distribution, you can see a lighter blue bar for what we're calling Wausau current. That's the quarterly estimated residential rate that reflects the impact of the current drinking water facility improvements that are under construction. And then the bar several places to the left of that says Wausau PFAS. That's where the Wausau's rate would fall with the impact of these potential alternatives or projects, with the orange bar representing the minimum rate impact scenario of the ones that we just looked at, and then the lighter orange bar representing basically the maximum rate impact. So there would be some movement to the left of that distribution, but still within sort of the center of it. And it's also important to note that, it's helpful to compare rates for communities that have similar treatment needs. None of these communities are currently treating for PFAS, and several of these communities don't have the same water quality or treatment needs in general that Wausau does. For example, the treatment needs in Neenah and Oshkosh and these Lake Winnebago communities are more in line with Wausau's water quality challenges compared to, say, the city of Bluegrass. Next slide, please. So we just have a few more summary slides here that we thought would be helpful. This one is intended to provide some perspective on what short-term strategies can look like and long-term strategies and the potential timeframes involved with those. So when we talk about short-term strategies, we're referring to solutions that would bridge the gap between essentially today and when a more permanent or long-term supplemental PFAS treatment solution is in place at the new water plant. And one potential track to take would be to start up the new drinking water plant and use the regenerable ion exchange resin that will be in place there for the benefit that we've observed it to provide. And if we get to a point, as we expect we likely would, where that resin needs to be replaced to maintain PFAS concentrations in the treated water meeting whatever goals the city establishes, then the resin could be replaced at that time. And the cost of replacing the entire inventory of that resin and disposing of it at this time is estimated to be on the order of $800,000 per event. The second option would be to focus on alternatives that use the shorter vessels and pursue a fast track procurement and contracting solution for getting at least a partial treatment solution in place, a partial form of supplemental GAC or ion exchange treatment downstream of the regenerable resin. The minimum time frame on that is estimated to be 6 months. The cost will depend on the exact size and construction of that solution, but a minimum of about 3 million. And one thing to keep in mind there is that we would have to consider funding with that option and eligibility for public money that would otherwise be available, because this approach would likely require single sourcing the equipment as well as a rapid contracting with a general contractor, as opposed to an approach for these long-term strategies where the city perhaps takes a more conventional contracting approach that follows all of the rules and eligibility requirements for public money in the form of grants or safe drinking water loan, low interest loan money through the revolving loan program. And the time frame for having that long-term solution in place is estimated to be a minimum of 18 to 24 months, just given that process of engineering, traditional contracting, and delivery, but certainly with an expedited time frame on every aspect of that as much as possible. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a recap of the 4 alternatives we've talked about, with a summary of some of the most relevant cost information, and then with an attempt to further narrow this down to maybe the 2 alternatives that we thought might be of the most interest to the commission and to the utility. So, for example, alternative 3, we could consider as a lower priority because in this case, the only strong benefit of this alternative is speed, in the sense of the vessels being more readily available. But given the importance of preserving eligibility for public money to finance the improvements, it seemed that the lead time on new tall vessels would not be a schedule limiting factor. In the case of ion exchange, that's certainly an option, but it doesn't provide the same future flexibility that would be provided with the GAC alternatives. And that's with respect to several items, one of which is that there wouldn't be the ability to convert to GAC in the future without an expansion. And also the fact that GAC essentially casts a bit of a wider net in terms of treatment and water quality benefits. So it may position the utility better for other water quality objectives in the future. But alternative 1 and 2 are both promising and viable options. There's just a cost premium for alternative 1 as the most robust solution with no compromises, and then alternative 2 reflects a more value engineered approach, a cost saving GAC implementation that makes use of the option to operate the systems in parallel, but comes with more operating cost complexity and less reliability or security in terms of maximizing water quality benefits at all times. Next and last slide, please. Or second to last slide, excuse me. So in terms of a potential path forward, if the commission and the utility were to decide that GAC is the preferred solution in either the form of alternative 1 or 2, one potential path forward would be to use the regenerable ion exchange resin as the short-term strategy and replace it when needed during that short-term period before the long-term solution is in place. It's possible, because we only have 4 months of simulation, it's possible that there could be more than one replacement event needed. And so there is some cost risk that is hard to quantify there at this time. But that is an option that can be pursued. And then the tall GAC vessels could be procured as part of a conventional contracting approach to Safe Drinking Water Loan Program eligible. And then depending on the alternative or design selected and the availability of grant money or principal forgiveness, that maximum cost range is anticipated to be $12 to $16 million for the capital investment and a rate impact of about $2.90 to $3.60 a month for the average household. One important point that we also wanted to make for the long-term strategy is that using GAC initially does not commit the city to use of that particular media in perpetuity. There is the flexibility, particularly in how the vessels are designed and procured, to position the city to have the flexibility to switch to other media in the future if additional information in the future identifies cost savings, significant operating cost savings that can be passed on to ratepayers, and if there aren't other treatment objectives that require use of GAC. So one candidate, of course, would be switching to single-use ion exchange resin for cost savings if identified. But then thinking further ahead, there are emerging alternative media products that are hitting the drinking water market and are being studied in a variety of pilot testing throughout the country right now. And one of those, particularly a Fluorosorb product from Setco, is very promising from a cost standpoint because it has similar bed life to ion exchange resin, but at essentially half the cost. So there's flexibility to potentially optimize those life cycle costs in the future with the infrastructure that would be in place from an initial, say, GAC-based solution. And so with that, we can just go to the last slide here, and we thought it would be helpful to just summarize potential next steps as we see them at this time. And as the commission has time to think about this information, one of those would be a recommendation to continue pilot testing so that we can continue learning more about the performance over time of the regenerable ion exchange resin, and can also potentially expand the pilot to include emerging media like the Fluorosorb product that I just mentioned. In terms of implementing that long-term or permanent solution, one of the next steps would be to initiate design of that long-term solution, and then in parallel with that, pursue funding, PSC approval, and approval from those concept DNR for the solution that's proposed. So that is the end of our briefing today, and we're happy to address any questions that you have for us at this time.
All right, thank you. Questions, comments, thoughts from the commission?
So
Yep.
a question relative to if we access the funding that's available through the bipartisan infrastructure law that's coming through the state, that's on an annualized basis. Where would these be in terms of eligibility and reimbursement for the utility if we were to move ahead? I know that you have to be into the process with those to be eligible. Can you comment on that and how that would impact our cash flow as a utility?
Sure, absolutely. So with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, DNR is currently working on an intended use plan. They have most recently indicated that they are still working on it, and they intend to release that intended use plan here, hopefully yet in a couple weeks. It had been scheduled to be released in May. And so with that intended use plan, they will sort of open the gates with the intent to apply process for that the funds that are available through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And there will be various sort of pots of money, not only the emerging contaminants allocation, but then also additional funding for the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program. So, yeah, what we're trying to lay out here is the more immediate response where you would procure or I should say the faster, quicker response where you would procure the short vessels may cause some issues. We don't see those vessels necessarily being eligible if you procured them through a fast track process. But if you go with the longer term solution or the more conventional approach, then you would preserve your ability to access that funding. So sorry, that was a really long answer. I can't comment on the utility's cash flow, but certainly pursuing the more conventional procurement approach and accessing the bipartisan infrastructure law funding would help the utility from the standpoint of providing a significant amount of funds rather than having to draw down your cash.
So are we being asked today to advance an alternative, or what is before us today?
I think well, it says this isn't actionable, so it's presentation, discussion, and update. So I think maybe if we can provide some kind of directional,
I guess my concern is, and I've been tracking that, it's sitting on the PFAS External Advisory Group, where we're going, and one of the concerns that I have is, I've always been critical of the ITA process because it's an annual process versus a as-needed process, which is cumbersome, and if you come in a day late, you're a year late. And from a cash flow perspective, that matters, but it would be helpful to us is we're evaluating these options to look at timing of and sequencing of this and potential eligibility for grants. It's not going to get easier to get grants in the future, and there's a number of factors that go into whether it's a grant or a forgivable loan, or what the factors are, which have long-term implications to, again, that cash flow. And I think we have to give some consideration to how that might impact us and the net impact on the ratepayer. I did have a question relative to when you put the projected cost in there. Did you factor in all of the stepped increases associated with the facilities, and are all of the water costs got borne in the current rate? Or, I know we were phasing in certain rates. So will the rates go up based upon commitments that we've already made in the staging and the sequencing of those rate increases?
Valerie may be able to speak to this better than me, but I believe we are looking at that. We're going to be looking at that through the PSC process. They're going to evaluate and see if we do, in fact, need another increase to cover our costs.
So, but I thought we also stepped the impact on the ratepayers as part of our, as part of the borrowing.
We did, and we have all of those approved step rate increases implemented now.
Okay.
And we are to the phase where we want to get the completed construction costs, and there'll be one final rate study to see if we need any additional rate increase.
Associated with this.
As we go into the operations phase, yes.
more questions, comments?
This is a very basic question, but I want to make sure I understand what we're looking at. The presentation, which again was very good, talked about costs, capital and operating to these various alternatives, or four alternatives. When we look at the next to last slide, called Potential Path Forward, we see a short-term strategy using regenerable IX, and then we see a long-term strategy where the recommendation apparently is to supplement IX with GAC, which would give us some flexibility for, I assume, emerging contaminants that we may face in the future. But my question is, these cost estimates, is that just for the long-term strategy, or does it include the short-term strategy, or is that a separate cost that's really not covered in the slides?
So in the case of the potential path forward that we show on the second to last slide, the short-term strategy costs are separate from what we're presenting for the long-term strategy, in the sense that if there's one or more replacements needed of the regenerable ion exchange resin, that would be a separate cost incurred beyond the cost to implement the long-term strategy.
Yeah.
Could I impose upon Evan, we've got a secondary engineering firm. Can you comment on approaches, and have you had a chance to evaluate these?
Sure. So we at Wood and our team have been involved over the last month or so, working with Donahue, and they've brought us along on their development of these alternatives. We've provided some feedback on, our perspectives of the technologies and the implementation of those technologies and these alternatives. We did have a site walk with Donahue last night and a new plant, and then we had a work session where we worked through these various options. We haven't had an opportunity to review the details of all of the various alternatives and the costing. We expect to do that when a tech memo is prepared, but we are providing feedback and input throughout this process.
So let me ask this generic question. If, let's say that we're currently operating as a threshold in the drinking water standard or the recommendation recommended by the Department of Health Services, and my understanding is that EPA is coming out in the very near future with the proposed number. If that number were along the lines of California or lower, what system, if we decrease the threshold from, let's say, 20 parts per trillion to 2 or 5, what would that do to our cost? Would it be consequential? I know you were looking at no detect, but if you've got breakthrough and you're running parallel systems, if you're running a parallel system at 20 parts per trillion versus at 2 parts per trillion or 5 parts per trillion, there's a little bit more conservativeness in your approach, and your cost therefore will go up. How does anything, if EPA's numbers come out, and everybody's assuming they will come out lower than where DHS is, what will that do to the cost estimates?
I was going to say, Andrew, if you want to field that one, you've spent the most time looking at those and thinking about costs.
Sure, yep, I can speak to that for a minute and then welcome any other comments others might have. But essentially, there are a couple important considerations to the questions that the Commissioner Robinson raised. So one is the point that, when we look at alternative 1 versus alternative 2, so a traditional lead lag setup that's more expensive versus a value engineered parallel operation type setup, there is more security, so to speak, or a lower risk that there would be treatment goal exceedances with the lead lag approach compared to a parallel approach. And that's particularly true the lower those treatment goals are driven. And so when we talk about hypothetical goals that are well below 20, to me, the value or the risk mitigation presented by the alternative 1, the lead lag setup, becomes more significant. The other way to look at it from an operating cost standpoint is that, in theory, you might be changing your beds out that much more frequently or that much more conservatively the lower those limits are. Frankly, in both approaches, but particularly in the parallel operation approach. And so in that case, the operating costs, when we present a range of operating costs, they're more likely to be in the upper portion of that range or upper half of that range, let's say, relative to the middle or lower portion of that range. But because we can't predict ahead of time exactly what that bed life will be and how much shorter it would be at, say, 2 parts per trillion versus 10 parts per trillion, it's hard to quantify it exactly, but that's where we try to use ranges to help provide perspective of kind of the relative costs among these alternatives and to help make decisions in the context of most probable ranges as opposed to just a static number.
Other questions or comments? Any thoughts on directionally, any feedback there? I mean, I think we do have to be prepared for the fact that we'll likely be seeing much lower parts per trillion regulatory and health advisory standards than what we have right now.
I don't think we're in a position to make a decision today for that.
We can't,
And other
actually.
reasons, yes, I understand. But I think we need more evaluation of what we're looking at. I don't know the timing of those regulations, John, but
If I could just comment on that, EPA will come out with a recommendation, and they'll have to go through the formal process of establishing the standard, which can take 2 to 3 years. It's a slow process, slower than Wisconsin's administrative rule process, so, and there's challenges, but the problem is you've got a standard out there in the works, and I think the expectation of the public is that you're going to meet those standards, so we'll have to wrestle with that idea on that interim basis, but I guess my concerns are just the timing, sequencing, and an impact on the cash flow from a financial perspective. If we could have, even if we need a special meeting, I think it's imperative that we try to get that system in place as soon as we can. And if we even needed a special meeting to look at if we fronted the money, and if we fronted the money and if we were reimbursed, what might that do to the rates? If we weren't reimbursed, the different scenarios. Because there will be a lot of demand, and the cost, obviously, based upon this, the cost of treatment is going to be significant, and again, those dollars are limited on a statewide basis. And the money will be spent over 5 years, and I think we want to get in there early. So I think it would be worthwhile to perhaps have a good financial analysis of the potential up and downsides of the various approaches and what the impacts could be, and what would be eligible, what would not be eligible under the current understanding. Without that plan of action, or that action plan from the state, it's hard to comment, and that plan will be put out for comment as well. So it'll come out, and we'll have an opportunity for public input, and we may want to weigh in on that, but that ITA process is not conducive for quick decision-making if you miss that deadline. So I think potentially even a special meeting might be worthwhile.
I would concur. John is right that we have to get this in place as soon as possible. That's what the public expects, and that's what we as a commission want to do. But it also has to be the right decision. So I think a special meeting with perhaps questions and concerns fed into the process before the meeting so that the agenda is formed around our questions and concerns, that would be appropriate in my view. And I would think certainly before the July meeting, we need to have that meeting.
Does that financial analysis seem feasible for our teams here? I'm seeing nodding, yep. Okay. I would think probably in the next week or two then.
That has to include our utility staff
Yep.
as well. So we're making that commitment of your time.
So I think one of the things, that we did when we did the design of the new facilities was we ended up establishing, we borrowed money up front. We already have the reimbursement resolutions in place, and so I think it is a good idea for us to have a communication in meeting just specifically on finances and determine what the best approach on this is. You're right, John, it's a very long, kind of arduous process with intent to apply and then everything else that follows along with it. Unfortunately, that's going to be the avenue we have to follow in order to get any of these forgivable loans. So yeah, we'll do our best to put as much information as we can together over the next couple of weeks and bring it before you. And we'll probably end up getting Ellers involved as well. They've been preparing information on our rate cases as we've been moving forward too, so.
Okay. Yeah.
May I just add?
Yes, as long as you use the mic.
All right, I will use the mic. So, and with that financial planning, I guess I would just add that as long as you preserve your eligibility for the loan, you could use some form of interim financing and build that into the program so that, maybe you don't get the loan the first round, but you preserve your eligibility, and then, you throw your hat in the ring again. So, yeah, with your permission, we'll work with staff and with Ellers and
I think that's-
bring numbers back to you.
Mr. Forrest.
At this special meeting, are we in a position to decide which of these paths forward we're going to pursue? Because costs and timing are going to depend on that.
Do you feel that you,
I couldn't do it right now, but I would like the meeting to be structured such that we can have a understandable discussion of the alternatives and come to a consensus about what we want to do. I think that decision is important as a first step.
I think that probably that requires, maybe, we need to think about what kind of questions do we need answers to before that next meeting. I think we can share that probably with utility staff, if there are things that you need.
Well, I think we would want to do, again, we need to do some scenario planning. In that scenario planning is, if we do the work with the Safe Drinking Water Act funding, without what happens as our interim, I think ideally, we would know what that plan of action or that state plan is, because that would help drive some of our discussion. So I think we have to be careful that, while it's important we move, but we need to know where the state is looking. I think much of that is being prescribed by EPA and the feds, but I don't know how much flexibility there'd be on the state level. But the ITA process is a state process. But so if we could run, if we funded all of it, if we funded some with interim funding, if we did some and captured others, do we know, as we begin to look at different resins, do we know what the market is? And as with most environmental cleanup, in cases the cost comes down as the technology matures and there's more competition. I shouldn't say generally it happens, not in all cases, but generally you'll see additional competitive prices hold that down. If we could give some thought to what that might mean if you're using resins in there. And GAC is GAC, and GAC has been around for a long time, and that price is pretty known. But if we could look at what some scenarios might be, and again, future-proofing it to the best that we can. How do we design it from the perspective of, while we're dealing with PFAS, what will we do with endocrine disruptors? What will we do with other issues as they come through in the future, and protecting the public on a long-term basis when we begin to look at that versus the chemical of the month. If we can look at some permanency, and so Scott's not pulling his hair out every month when the new issue or flavor of the month comes up.
Sounds like a plan to me. Anything else for consideration here that we want to make sure we have? I know that I have a desire to move quickly, and the short-term solution is important. I am seeing that even short-term solutions are taking some time. But just understanding that the public is also asking for things like new filters for the pitchers we've handed out and things like that, and the cost that it will take for the shared ratepayers and taxpayers of the city here. It's important. Are we ready to move on, or do we want to have a couple other things?
What about the special meeting? Do we have an idea on the timing of that?
I think a week or two would make sense. Maybe we can send out an email, a poll.
2 weeks from today? How does that look, John?
We can maybe have Gina confirm with everyone.
We got 2 members not here.
Yeah, I know, but I don't want to let this just twist in the wind. I want to get it.
21st works for me.
It would work for me as well. But yes, let's let Gina do a poll.
Okay, thank you. All right, Gina will send out a note.
Thanks. Thank you.
That date actually doesn't work for me, but I want to be here. All right, we are moving on to item number 4, discussion and possible action on the approval of the 2021 Compliance Maintenance Annual Report, CMAR wastewater. Maybe I'll throw it over to Ben. Thank you.
So included in the packet is a copy of the 2021 Compliance Maintenance Annual Report, CMAR for short. It is just basically a report card. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Grades us on our performance at the plant, out in the collection system, what we're discharging into the Wisconsin River. And we received a very good grade, as you can see, on the final page of the report. And is there any questions that anybody has that I
Can
could
open the
answer?
floor up if you'd like to ask your questions. Do you require action on this to us to approve it and file it?
That's a good question. This
It says possible
is, I
action.
believe it goes to council after this.
Yeah, we'll need action on this to move it on to council, please.
Alrighty, so I guess I would entertain a motion to accept and approve the compliance maintenance annual report for 2021. I have a motion by Robinson and a second by
I'll
Force.
second with compliments. Good job.
Okay. All right, if there's no other discussion, all those in favor can signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Alrighty, that passes unanimously. All right, we're now into item number 5, discussion on employee staffing, recruiting, retention, and wages.
So we discussed this in May, and we had put some information together with regards to wages based on some national surveys as well as local surveys in the state. We're also looking at wages from other municipalities as well, to compile those. With the information that you have in front of you, I apologize it came out late today, but you can see where our utility for Wausau Water Works is significantly below averages. And these averages are compared to our point wages, which is categorized as market on our mid. So
Any questions or comments or needs? Mr. Robinson?
Well, the city is in between wage studies, but I know the county is doing a study now, but they've also taken some people out of sequence where we've had difficult time. I would request that city administration, mayor, look at what the results are. Yeah, I think it's important to have a uniform policy throughout the city, but bring back a report and recommendation to us from administration at the next meeting and to our next steps. We had talked about a task force, but I think there's some compelling data relative to our situation, and we'll also need to look at what the fiscal impact of that might be.
I will do my best. We are having some big changes as it relates to our HR department, so it might not be at the very next meeting, but I know this is a top priority here. We got to make sure we have the right people here working and they're compensated appropriately. Anything else? Okay. I guess with that, I would entertain the last item on our agenda, the motion to adjourn.
You want to make that motion?
A motion by
I'll make that motion.
Motion by Force.
Yes.
Second by Robinson. All those in favor can signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, that passes. Thank you.